I think the reason I'm invited today is actually an article I co-authored a long time ago with Eyal Weizmann, who may be known to most of you, who is certainly much more qualified to speak of qualifications than me to talk about exterritoriality. But since I collaborated with Eyal in several exhibitions and continued this engagement with the changing political geographies in other projects after working with Eyal, this problem of exterritoriality sort of migrated within my own concerns from, like up sort of immediately given political geographies that have their sort of direct manifestations in space towards more abstract geographies in which similar mechanisms might be at stake. And just to paint you the very large picture, I think that what really drives me is to kind of I think basically that the question of exterritoriality in a way haunts us just as the project to which it belongs, clearly in my eyes, which is an imperial project. And for the imperial project, which let's identify the imperial project roughly now with the time span since the discovery of the Americas, and hence with the colonial frontier, exterritorial spaces in to generalize brutally, I think have always had this interesting ambivalent status of a multi-stable figure, and that's something I'm genuinely interested in, because the frontier to which they belong is populated by many multi-stable figures, and I think art is one of them. A multi-stable figure is known, I guess, to most of you, although the word is ugly. It's this pictures or graphs in which figure-ground relationships are instable or can be reverted, right? Where you can see rabbit or duck or profile or vase. Now that's sort of figures, right? That have this instability in relation to figure ground, and you sort of enforce a choice upon you because it's very difficult to see both at once. Now the multi-stable figure of the ex-territorial island, of course, is that it's on the one hand sort of that outpost of an imperial project, a sort of the classic, the American frontier, let's say the fort is a classic of an outpost, an ex-territorial outpost of an imperial project within a territory of an order yet to come, imagined, and that order around sort of that non-existing order is sort of subjected or objected, if you will, to a particular intense imaginary. And that's probably what's interesting in the first place, thinking through that frontier things in relation to images, is that the frontiers are always intense producers of imaginaries, of images, of stereotypes, as is known to all of you. Now, so sort of, in contemporary talk about ex-territories, I think you could easily identify these multi-stable figure aspects as well. If the opposite to the fort on the frontier would be sort of the pirate utopia, which then was used by Hakim Bey for his historiography of the temporary autonomous zone. It's sort of the utopian ex-territory, right? That's sort of a space that is an island signifying an outside, a free space, right? Now, where would that be located within today's economy? Sort of the fort, the imperial version of the ex-territory, I think is quite easily identified in its multiple sort of morphologies, which, I mean, there are beautiful books about that. To mention just one, Keller Easterling wrote a beautiful book on sort of what she calls the confetti of empire, which is basically, a few of them were listed earlier in relation to, sort of special economic zones, the refugee camps, sort of all these spaces of laundering, camouflage, and exception in which a sort of order is yeah, basically laundering itself, no? Manifesting itself through it, projected outside, which is also what really interests me in terms of the economy of the modern frontier, is also an export economy always, like where something is exported into an outside, and the exterritorial space is sort of always the spatial manifestation of that. The export basically means that you make a division that it may be already symptomatic of internal contradictions and divisions. You project it into an outside and become sort of your the site where you dump all the discontent from the within. No? And that's also always multi-stable figures. No? A famous multi-stable figure, of course, is the primitive, which also exists in this sort of double figure, no? Of either the barbarian that is just sort of kind of almost subhuman or not quite, belongs more to animality and nature, or it's already sort of the paradisic state in which all these evil divisions that haunt us have been overcome, no? Sort of living in unity and harmony with. So you have exactly the same sort of figure of the multi-stable tilting in that. I think that what makes it interesting to talk today about this imperial geographies is because probably, and I'm just part of those who, I guess, trying to put their finger on this elusive phenomena, probably not so long ago something significantly has changed in the very nature of the imperial frontier, and that sort of plays on all registers. Let's say the simple register would be the spatial frontier, right? Sort of the globalization, meaning that sort of the spatial frontier has sort of reached its limits. There are no real outsides anymore. There aren't white blank spaces on maps anymore that would be sort of perfectly suited as dumping sites or projected paradises, right? Which means you sort of have to produce them now if you want to still have some. It also has something to do with the good side or the paradisic version of the utopian ex-territory, that sort of the 20th century history, and of course Israel is in a context in which this is quite interesting to discuss, of sort of creating ex-territorial utopian outsides. That's just in relation to sort of utopian social models have undergone a strange sort of experience of disappointment in terms of their ability to actually create the sort of to translate a concept into reality, and that has also to do with a systematic or systemic sort of closure, no? Like sort of that they actually experience that they are not in an outside, right? This outside is always already somewhere, and that this blankening out that is normally necessary to create this outside is never quite as innocent as a utopian mind would like to believe. So there has been this sort of set of experiences and other factors like the reaching the spatial limit that have led to a necessary rethinking of this whole economy of the frontier and the export regime that comes with it. And what I want to do briefly with you, and I'll just share a couple of notes, is basically trying to rehearse that on the example of a grand narrative, of modernity. I do that because I sort of started to believe in them again, which I know many people may not share, but I think that actually the broken continuity within the grand narratives is something that we need to rescue, that we need to appropriate, or sort of get our, like fill in the missing links that have sort of fractured them incredibly since that turning point. Before I apply that to the grand narrative of art, I just want to give you a last image for that sort of tilting point, which is another multi-stable figure, and that's sort of the emblematic image that NASA produced in the 60s, which took a couple of years to actually be published, and was done so under pressure of a guy called Stuart Brand, who was the publisher of the Whole Earth catalog in California, sort of hippie manual that was basically, a kind of magazine and catalog for all kind of crazy ideas and stuff you could order in the do-it-yourself movement for utopian Californian communities. And he actually used that image by NASA after he had managed to get them to release it on the cover of this Whole Earth catalog, and that's the image of Earth, the blue marble image. The image of Earth from the outside. The first image seen from Earth from the outside. And I think that's an interesting multi-stable figure when you think this in relation to the frontier and exterritorial spaces and the idea of the outside, because it's sort of the image from the outside that at the same time, you know, if you think of that sort of idea also of that time, no, kind of Cold War and still like the last moments where we believed in linear progress of science and so on, that sort of expansion to space, to the ultimate outside, actually turns into its opposite, tilts. The image of Earth, like this reversed gaze onto the planet, is actually the agent. The image itself becomes the agent of a closure, of a complete systemic closure, in the sense, you know, perfectly sort of articulated by Buckminster Fuller, who was also sort of a symptomatic genius of that thinking, that shift, right? Still within the modernist paradigm, because he saw the whole Earth, you know, the first sort of architect and engineer that would see the whole Earth as a planning, an object of planning, right? Where the scale has dramatically changed of previous kind of spatial thinking. And his term for that, known to most of you, I guess, you know, is the famous expression of the spaceship Earth. No? But I think that ever since this image was published, it's sort of still on its way back, right? It's sort of the agent that announces, like a cosmic agency that announces the end of the outside. But it's the beginning of this sort of immanentization that ever since happens. Of sort of, you know, there is no outside to society, to the ecosystem, etc. No? So, and the very question of what within that would be still within this new geography that is fundamentally changed the very feeling of what is the common ground on which we stand. What is politics is a big question, right? Because it's also like, of course, the final realization of sort of holist concepts that make the contemporary frontier in thinking, justifying, legitimizing politics. And holism has this wonderful ability to eliminate frontiers, which is what you could perfectly see in the sort of you know, popular imaginary of the 90s. The surfer out on the waves would be one of them. Sort of this sort of, you know, holistic imagery of permanent flow and possibility and imagination, but at the same time, within that, all frontiers are sort of pacified, right? Camouflaged away. So that's sort of the basic kind of set of the grand narrative I just wanted to use as an introduction. Now, the story of art, you know, emerges from this simple question of trying to understand what happens when you enter a space like a gallery, which certainly in some ways could be called an exterritorial space, a space of exception, even though in very different ways, of course, and I don't want to stress the analogy too much, then let's say Guantanamo Bay, right? I don't want to suggest any more similarities between this kind of spaces, other than that they are subjected to certain rules of exceptionality. When you enter this space of a gallery, and when this problem first began to become relevant for me, I did actually sit in the entrance of an art institution. My office was just at the entrance. I could basically see people entering it, and I became incredibly interested in the way gestures change, and sort of the body would sort of, on the threshold to the space of art, the sort of classical white cube, would undergo a moment of reprogramming, like something very difficult to actually articulate what's happening there, but it's happening. You know, the way eyes would orient themselves and so on. So I was just thinking, like, what the hell is that very script that is written into these thresholds that apparently the body, to a certain degree, reads without ever needing a reading eye, but sort of telepathically this is communicating itself to you know, intelligible beings. Now, the crucial history of that, the way this script or program that I would like to suggest to call a magic circle, so like, you know, some magician has drawn a magic circle around the space of art. That means both conceptually and physically. It's a magic circle that is sort of become part of the concrete of the very gallery walls. The crucial part of that history hasn't been written. It's stunning, in fact. I'm absolutely not legitimized to write it. I'm just not equipped. I'm a dilettante. But it's still a stunning fact to remember that the history of how art became autonomous around that time of the French Revolution hasn't never been written. There's not a single book that actually, many books refer to it, but most have footnotes saying that it doesn't exist yet, and it's the fact today. The prehistory of that becoming autonomous, the non-written history of that, is of course the story of the secularization of art, which is sort of always been brought up in the kind of relation between medieval arts and Renaissance arts. No? When art leaves the space of religion, the sacred, and becomes a matter of, you know, representation within a new merchant society, and something genuinely profane develops, which is very connected to a history of new subjects, the entrepreneur, and the sort of universalist Renaissance subject. That's the prehistory of this becoming autonomous that is always invoked. No? Like, no reference to that story without that prehistory. The story itself then brings up, like, of this becoming autonomous, always quotes, and I promise I will not quote more Germans today, always brings in, and that's kind of interesting in terms of this whole geography between, you know, Germany where the revolution didn't happen but the philosophy happened, and France where it happened. It's Kant and Schiller. No? Kant, who brings up this aesthetic paradigm of without interest, no? Aesthetic contemplation without interest, as a sort of basic division that cuts off the sphere of the aesthetic from everything else, meaning everything in use, everything instrumental, with direct application in the world. And the other story being that of Schiller, the aesthetic education of man, also claiming an autonomy of art on quite different grounds, because here there is an interest. The interest is basically that, and that's a very interesting part of the story, that the becoming autonomous of art has to do with the history of the division of labor within capitalist societies as they were emerging, and, you know, labor got increasingly differentiated, and basically people would, by becoming specialists only in one thing, sort of lose any relation to the greater whole of life, of so on. And Schiller's idea would basically be that only in the space of art there is a possibility to regain that wholeness of experience, where there is already something quite different entailed in this idea than in Kant's without any interest, because there's this idea of autonomy becoming sovereignty, no? Which is basically something that has programmed the whole modern debate ever since. Autonomy would basically mean art is just one island within an emerging geography of disciplinary islands, right? Where things have their clear sort of job, right? So the different disciplines of knowledge, the different institutions, and art is just one among them, which is there for aesthetic contemplation, without use, without instrumental reason, etc. While the sovereignty of art is this idea that there is something in the wholeness of experience that would reconquer all that differentiated landscape and undo the very divisions that are made there. Huh? The wholeness of experience, the wholeness of knowledge, etc. The story normally goes on in terms of the grand narrative as a story of purification, and that's pretty much within this sort of island story of disciplines. No? Each discipline sort of takes care of what it's responsible for and sort of gradually purifies its object, makes more clear what it actually deals with and what it's not its territory. Right? Every discipline of knowledge as well. So art does the same thing. So basically, gradually each of the arts discovers more and more what is its own and sort of separates what is not its own. No? Like, so then you have sort of aestheticism and the La Polar rule as a sort of turning point within that story. No? A sort of turning point within the merely aesthetic, where sort of a reflective moment is made possible, because only through that sort of purification, the mimetic paradigm through which art until then had to still deal with outsides, simply by represent, copying, or having any kind of mimetic relationship that it was made accountable for, would be possibly broken. Now, within this story, the next step is sort of becoming institutionally aware of art, so that the institution of art could become a matter of critique. No? Only through the purification, only when you know what only belongs to art and each discipline within it, you can sort of start to see the institution of art as something that is like the threshold script in the gallery that is already there before any art is made, right? The institution of art in the bourgeois society, in that case. But before getting into this institutional aspect, there is of course a stronger history that is, in many cases, sort of overriding, is a stronger tsunami, which is the story of the historical avant-gardes. And that has ambivalent histories, but I'll put just one idea I wanted to plant before moving forward, is that already the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, is a quite interesting manifestation of the historical avant-gardes in terms of its claim to wholeness of experience. But then the more classic historical avant-garde understanding sees this claim to sovereignty in a radical break with the very magic circle that has been drawn around it. No? So if artists, by some historical magic, were all forced to sort of to sign a contract, an imaginary contract, with their very blood, like the devil's contract, which made them autonomous but for a price. The avant-gardes were those who were not willing to pay this price, who thought that this contract is a shame, the contract of exterritoriality. Because what is the price they paid is inconsequentiality, is to be politically inconsequential. And it's the price that is paid of fictionality, of being mere art, mere fiction, never quite real. This is quite an interesting thing to think through, I find, because sort of, just in the light, I mean, the story is a little bit boring, but just in the light of the fact that all these distinctions are sort of completely not so clear anymore today, when you think through, going back to the question of the division of labor, what constituted the fine arts, autonomous art, is basically the fundamental cut from the fine arts from mere crafts. No? So there was a sort of extra added to mere craft, so sort of separating craft from art and then the applied art from the fine arts and so on, is one genealogy that leads to this situation, which is basically a situation that the historical avant-garde contest. And of course the Russian situation is emblematic for that. No, they don't accept to be exempt from the sphere of life, except sort of in a state of exception from politics. They do everything to break that to break the spell of that magic circle, to go back to life, back into politics, become real again, become applied again, etc. That's of course also only one part of the story. Another part of the story is that within this historical avant-garde logic, there's a totally new relation to negation and affirmation, because the claim to sovereignty of art means basically a total negation of the existing order. No? And the way to sovereignty is through negation. Just think of Dada. No? The way to new sense is through nonsense, for example. I find this quite interesting when you think this through with the other paradigm I've been mentioning, the sort of becoming figure of the institution. No? What was a mere background until then, it becomes suddenly a figure, the institution of art. And of course, Duchamp, for example, plays a major role in this, starting to map the institutional systemic boundaries, without quite contesting them, because I think what distinguishes Duchamp from a lot of other Dadaists and historical avant-gardists is that his relation to the institutional magic circle is totally ambivalent, because he's not so eager in just undoing it, right? He's sort of discovering a new economy in it, in which basically every act of negation, of protest, if it's successful, would lead to an affirmation on a higher plane. And that, of course, is also the history of the pictorial arts, which then modernism has made sort of into the leading media, no? The leading medium, because all other arts are less pure in the modernist argument, no? They're contaminated with so much that is not just their own, no? So the sort of becoming master narrative of pictorial arts until the late 60s, from sort of in the story of the modern, is linked to this economy of negation that becomes affirmation on a higher plane. Think of Malevich's Black Swans. So like every act of negating the pictorial plane within the pictorial plane necessarily leads to the affirmation of this on a higher plane. It's a kind of interesting story that is, of course, becoming a bit weird when the whole sort of project that is sort of scripted there loses this direct relation to the act of negation, and therefore also maybe its interesting relation to the act of, its possible politics, and starts to focus on this question of medium specificity, where sort of the autonomy question is dissociated from the question of, let's say, the temporary autonomous zone, where its autonomy is clearly a question of a political question of what it means to be in an order, or what is a possible being outside an order, and becomes the autonomy of an objectified autonomy, an autonomy that belongs to the work. Like it's a very strange sort of objectifying of the idea of autonomy, creating a big set of misunderstandings which has made it really boring to talk about this autonomy stuff at all, no? Because it's just completely like sort of contaminated by that history. Another last sort of aspect of this period of the historical avant-garde up to the 60s that I wanted to bring in is basically, I've mentioned that already, but just to make it more clear, comes back to the multi-stable figure aspect. Sort of that within the idea of negation, affirmation that has turned systemic and has always sort of turned into a twisted dialectics, there is a continuous movement that is itself pretty much like the imperial frontier, an ever-expanding frontier, in which whatever has been background in the next move is turned into figure. So it's this sort of economy of sort of, what writes art history, a partial narrative of that history writing is explication of implicity, explication of implicit backgrounds. And that's something that is sort of remained unbroken until very recently. No? So you think of institutional critique, for example, is just another sort of the conditions in which art is placed, the background becomes the figure itself, right? Now I'm trying to understand this shifting moment where the image of Earth was published. And it's an interesting moment in art, right? Because it's the end of modernism. It's the end of the purification regime. It's sort of the end of the exterritoriality, the successful claim of the exterritoriality of art within its own imperial history, its own linear progress that would be such a successful appropriation machine as well. No? But Jan, would you mind ordering me a beer? Am I talking too long? Like 5 minutes? I found Jeff Wall as an art historian really useful in trying to understand that shift, you know, because he talks in a very precise way about that economy of negation, affirmation in the pictorial plane, and then he talks about what is the role of conceptual art in changing that historical paradigms. And he sort of describes it, how do you call it in English, the thing in the needle that you put the eye of the needle, right? He describes it as an eye of the needle. So if there are these purification regimes, they're sort of center, and then there's like focus on the eye on the needle, and when something happens that it changes everything. And that is basically within the sort of systemic reflection on the institution of art and this affirmation negation economy. He says that conceptual art has focused on the sort of within the logic of purification. It has purified the systemic logic of art in the sense of trying to get to the point where sort of the minimum version of what could, by reasonable argumentation, be refused as art, right? So the legitimization of art becomes itself the very sort of authorial act, where basically a label would do everything. The mere declaration, which is also the moment of the dematerialization of the art object, because you don't need the object anymore. You just need the systemic legitimization. If there is no good reason that you can use to refuse, and thank you very much, refute this legitimization, it's art. Now, Jeff Wall describes the history that follows that eye of the needle as a history of explosive expansion and re-dynamization. So, if what was characteristic of the pictorial arts that he refers to is basically the static, and within the static of the pictorial plane, the dialectics between stasis and movement. Then now, what happens is that the time-based arts are the first who are newly entering the contemporary art field, because now we no longer live in the modernist art paradigm. We start with contemporary art. And that's sort of emblematic figures, of course, John Cage and Alan Capro and so on. So like the living body and the event, it becomes dance, for example, in New York, of course. But sort of everything that by definition had to remain outside that purified notion of the modernist paradigm is slowly entering the field of art, or not so slowly, in fact. Jeff Wall calls that a second appearance, and that's probably the only reason why I'm allowed to talk here today without having such surfing skills like him, is because that is also the moment with the second appearance that things make. Like dance is becoming part of the visual arts without being dance proper. It's dance in brackets, in parentheses, no? And it doesn't have to be good dance anymore. So the roles, the classical roles and skills and distribution of agency is completely redistributed. And the dilettante has incredible historical chances, which is also why curators came up, I think. But possibly also, there was a job to do from now on in terms of mediation, which I think they've done really poorly until now. In a quite interesting way, like the project of figure ground explication, in which a particular frontier of the arts has situated itself, like, you know, whatever was a background condition that was, you know, sort of this implicit contract written into the rule of the game before is turned into a subject matter of the work itself. This has never stopped, right? Absolutely the opposite. So this sort of politicization of the neo avant-gardes is very much bound to you know, referring and finding formats to bring the conditions under which art happens into the field of the explicable. You know, the social conditions, the economic conditions. Think of Hans Haake now and his making the funding system of the Guggenheim into a subject matter of work. And you know, I think this is just an important prehistory to understand why we are able to talk today in a context that is still circumscribed by this magic circle about basically everything, right? Because this question of conditions of art then sort of slowly became less and less important, right? So, because we can basically appropriate everything and discuss it under different terms and dilettante terms in the arts, which is a great exterritorial function, of course, because it gives us the freedom to talk in ways that are undisciplined about things, right? Everything was disciplined before, and the arts were sort of just one island, at least in the autonomy paradigm, not in the sovereignty paradigm. There, in the sovereignty paradigm, they were always angry at everything else and always claimed the right to talk about everything else. Huh? But in the autonomy one, they just did what was only them. Even if this experience of wholeness was a potentially bigger one, they would not contest that. They would never try, for example, to have discourses on geopolitical issues, right? That was nothing that concerned a sort of autonomous pure art. Now, I'm trying to understand, and I'm absolutely not, I haven't gotten very far. I'm trying to understand what has happened with this bracketing function that is sort of the only thing that is left of the magic circle ever since that expanded field, which, as it is often called, of contemporary art has emerged. So one quality of that bracketing function I've already mentioned. It's basically that you don't need to be qualified, and that it's mimetic, in the sense that it can appropriate things by mimicking them. Think of certain biennale practices where, you know, you have like a, you know, whatever social project that suddenly, you know, mimics a real social project but takes place within the biennale, no? To the degree that many politically minded artists would not even be claiming that there is any difference, no? Which I think is maybe a bit dangerous, because it's sort of blind to the fact that there are, of this magic circle, a lot of systemic rules that have remained. That means that when you do a sort of, you know, social education project within a biennale, it is certainly not the same as it would be if you were not doing it in there. No? There's processes of evaluation, particularly, which leads me to suspect that there is something in the bracketing function that has a lot to do with current forms of capitalization, of, you know, in the terms of added and shifted value. But I'm not one of them who would only try to criticize that expanded field, because I think the other option that is often brought up by people who feel uncomfortable, like Jeff Wall, with that expanded field, is to go back to the old purification regime. And I think that's a bad choice. I don't want to go back there, no? Into the stupid hierarchies that were, and this sort of appropriation methods that were used by them. So the alternative seems to me that there's nothing left other than understanding really what these brackets do, and also trying to find a version that is not just criticizing this for, you know, like the sort of big layman on the end of critique, which is a funny sort of flip side of that old story of negation turning into affirmation on a higher plane, is that today we have a lot of people in the arts who constantly like wonder, you know, whether that critique has not already long time turned into an affirmation because we are anyway part of a corrupt system, right? That may be true, but it doesn't lead anywhere. So what is needed is, you know, that may be quite a good foil to be to know, because of course we are part of these systems and we are immanent to them. There's no more outside to be claimed with innocence. But I think that other continuities are also desperately needed. And I just think one thing that made me really wonder for quite a long time is, why is it exactly that in the contemporary art field in the last 10 years, like all these big events basically, in terms of motives, no, one thing that you cannot but encounter a lot is migration. So that in the sense, you know, this sort of transport of the experience of migration into the brackets of art may have something to do with the modernizing function of the ex-territorial or exceptional space of art, no? And I like to think that in relation to, you know, what was maybe always quite interesting about that becoming sort of exceptional of the sphere of art through that magic circle, is that it was a space in which ontological insecurities could be tested, no? So it's sort of this model space where the whole order of the relation between subject and object could be tested in different forms, but remained a model, a rehearsal, no? Sort of the question of how that would get transported into the real would always be a big question mark. Huh? You would know how to get in, but not out. But in fact, there is, you know, something very fundamental in terms of that mimicry between ontological insecurity and the experience of migration, right? Because migration and the sort of the displacement experience is fundamentally concerned with ontological insecurities, broken continuities, and you know, radical shifts of context, where sort of the breach of other magic circles, such as constitute sort of, you know, functioning community and relation to place and so on, has become, you know, a global phenomena that interestingly seems to communicate with the magic circle of art. I just wanted to end maybe with another sort of thought experiment that would place this frontier of the exceptional space of art within a larger modern geography. I've mentioned already the sort of differentiation of and the division of labor that comes with it, such as the division of you know, manual labor from intellectual labor, which is a big theme today in art as well. So that seems to be intimately related. No? So for example, I work in Taiwan at the moment and have this incredible experience of you know, a completely different history, where that sort of master narrative I just told is just not there. The historical division between crafts or applied art and fine arts or autonomous art has never been made. And then you have a really interesting situation where a young artist comes to you and tells you a story of that his father is a calligrapher, and they have huge fights at the family table because in fact his father is really angry at him because he doesn't understand what he's doing, and he thinks he's a dilettante. He's not allowed to do what he's doing because he actually quoted his father's calligraphy in an Asian Biennale, no? And his father is utterly resistant to this idea that the quote itself and the dilettante way of doing it would be valued more highly than his masterful calligraphy. No? What basically happens is that the frontier function of art, of which we are, insofar we are part of that system, are part of, has sort of manifested on that family table, because the father in this moment becomes no longer modern, no? While the son is modern. So sort of this bracketing function is incredibly linked to a modern frontier genealogy. Within the Latourian model of modernization, the exhibition and art actually occupy a really interesting place. I don't know if you're familiar with this because it would be difficult. Now it would be possible, but anyway, earlier it wasn't. So I'm not showing the graph, but I can show it on my face, no? Because the graph of Latour for the modern constitution is just like a face. You have like two circles around the eyes, one line here, and then you have a beard here. The two eyes, the circles of the eyes, are what he calls the houses, like parliaments, and they are also spaces of purification. One is the space in which subjects get purified, the other is where objects get purified. And this division between subject and object, people and things, science and objects, is sort of the first paradigmatic qualification of modernity. And the process of modern history ever since is purifying these two things. No? Sort of, if I'm wanting to accuse you of being not modern, I would show you that you're still projecting too much of your subjective thing onto the object, for example. So mixing them up, right? So this science is the one side where objects get purified, and the subject side basically is politics, no? where speaking autonomous subjects are created. Of course, also only through cutting off and dividing everything, creating that sort of outside on which they can project their sort of the divisions that they make, actually, like the primitives, like insane people, like and so on. So the second division, that would be by my mouth, this was the subject-object division, that would be the division between theory and practice, no? And also the division between modern and non-modern. Because what the whole point of Latour's "we have never been modern" is that we have actually never been modern, meaning that we have only done this in theory, of course connected to real practices, but in fact the practice is translated in making a beard. And the beard is basically the network, no? Like creating ever more hybrids, ever more implication, knotting things and science, people and objects together in ever new ways, and this is of course called, the biggest part of that is called technology, and the results we know through climate change and so on. Like where these things, where culture and nature can no longer be separated. Now, I think that what is great about this model is that he says there's only two official ways of representation in the classical age of modernity, which is, you know, objects which are the matter of science, and they need to be purified, or subjects which are the speaking autonomous subjects of politics, right? What is not allowed to be represented is that side below the mouth, right? The hybrids, the mess. And that's why, you know, we had to sort of be so evil to those we call primitives, while we are actually creating networks like them, right? But we are not allowed to represent that and acknowledge that as reality, because otherwise the purification system would break down as that what is really real. But in fact, there is a third house, and the third house is art. No? There's not only the house of politics and the house of science, there's a third official. There is actually an official institution in modernity that is allowed to present hybrids, mixed up things and subjects, objects and subjects, science and things. And that is art. It's the museum. Because an art object by definition is a hybrid. No? By definition is a subject-object hybrid where even starting to purify that is a strange idea. So in that very geography of Latourian modernity, Greenbergian monism is a very funny, almost clownesque attempt to purify the hybridity, to become medium-specific, while the medium per se is the most unpurifiable thing, no? Because the medium is exactly what mixes up things, no? Like, brings you in communication, entangles you. Every experience of mediality is one of unpurification, necessarily. I think that thinking through this upper line also makes complete sense to understand sort of the uncertainty and nervosity that made in modernity images always multi-stable figures, no? Because they always have to belong to one side. Either they have to be documentary in the sense of being really true to the object, or they are just subjective, created by humans and have no grasp on. So this whole economy of iconoclasm and its sort of the reformulation of the iconoclastic paradigm, when it emerges from a religious context into a modern one, is perfectly situated here. What Latour sort of misses in when he makes exhibitions, is that, you know, this economy may have, you know, also incredibly intelligent functions. No? He dismisses this critique altogether. But this is why, I think, because he has never placed the exhibition in his cosmography as a third house, which is basically situated here. You know, the lower part being already in the sort of the extension of official representation into that which is not allowed to be represented, networks, hybridity, mixtures of things and signs, and the upper part being in this purification regimes. No? Like, because what happens, for example, if a tractor is out of use, it's either going to the dump, or it's got to the trash, or it goes to the museum, right? As an officially representable hybrid. And sort of you can almost make a complete geography of the object system in terms of applied arts, fine arts, scientific museums, and all the kind of typologies of museums that you can actually situate quite well in the center of that divisions, where the first division, object and subject, and the second between theory and practice and modern and non-modern, are intersecting. What remains of this today is only the bracketing function, but maybe the bracketing function gives you the ability of an incredible freedom, as long as the mimicry that we do is actually a conscious one and can turn into an experience of, can turn the experience of ontological insecurity into a sovereign experience. And that's basically like sort of where I wanted to arrive, is that there is, I wanted to defend, you know, that magic circle as against more attempts to cross or dilute the magic circle and sort of, you know, get rid of what art divides from what divides art from everything else. I wanted to defend it and say it's one of the last purifying circles that we have, right? Because the others are no longer working so well. And actually it's good to have a purifying circle, because it allows you to be incredibly precise about what it means to be in networks, in systems. You know? It can be a place through which the historiography that modernity was not able to write of its own frontiers can be written. And by basically, and that's the last thing I wanted to mention, there's of course the history of subjectivation in art. No? Sort of, why did this space, this magic circle, be associated from the beginning with the subject is a big question, but it was, I mentioned, the merchant, sort of the self-portrait of the profane merchant. And today I think, you know, and you could say that, you know, somebody, Andy Warhol, understood that shift that I mentioned, the eye of the needle, very well, and he understood what it has to do with the image of the self becoming a genre itself, where the space of art turns into a testing ground for vectors, for systemic vectors of subjectivation, where you could test vectors of subjectivation, become a subject without actually having to identify. And that's, you know, an old formula of sovereignty, that this rehearsal of subjectivity without the compulsion to identify constitutes an experience of sovereignty. That's why I defend art as an exterritorial space and as a method of purification. Thank you.